Ada for refusing to help out my lying uncle? When my grandmother passed away, I was 16 years old. Her death marked a pivotal moment in our lives, not just emotionally but also in terms of the small inheritance she left behind. Our family, far from affluent, clung to the little we had. The only asset of any significance was her fractional ownership of a plot of land being drilled for natural gas. It wasn't a fortune, but it provided a modest income, something to rely on when times got tough. That land, and the royalties it generated, was divided among her 4 children, my mother, her 2 brothers, and her sister. It was a straightforward arrangement initially, but as life often goes, complications emerged over time. Out of her 4 children, 2 of my uncles have since passed away. The division of their shares, however, followed different paths. One uncle, who had no children of his own, had his portion returned to the collective pot. That share was subsequently redistributed among the 3 remaining original accounts, preserving its value within the family. The other uncle, who left behind children, had his share passed directly to them, maintaining the intended familial lineage. This arrangement exemplified a level of simplicity and clarity rarely seen in matters of inheritance, and we were fortunate that the transition occurred without contention, at least on the surface. When my uncle passed, the process to transfer his share was surprisingly seamless. All that was required was a death certificate, and once it was submitted to the company managing the royalties, the payments began flowing to his children without delay. By the following month, their royalty checks were already arriving in the mail. These were modest sums, just a few $100s at most, but the process was smooth and efficient because of the groundwork laid beforehand. My family had prepared the necessary documentation, ensuring that everything was in order well in advance. This foresight spared everyone involved from the potential headaches of legal disputes or drawn-out proceedings. Inspired by this experience, I decided to take similar measures to secure the transition of my mother's share when the time eventually comes. It cost $600 to complete the paperwork, but I saw it as a worthwhile investment to ensure that my mother's portion of the royalties would transfer seamlessly. I don't expect to need this for many years, but the peace of mind it provides is invaluable. Now, my mother and her remaining brother are the sole surviving children of my grandmother. This particular uncle and his wife have always harbored the misconception that my mother is swimming in wealth. The reality, however, couldn't be further from the truth. My mother, a caregiver to both of her brothers in their final days, has lived her entire life on a tight budget. She's had to stretch every dollar, often relying on me for financial support. There are times when she manages to pay me back for the help I provide, but more often than not, I convince her to keep the money. My husband and I live comfortably, thanks to his stable income, which is equivalent to what we would earn collectively if both of us held mid-level jobs. While we're able to make ends meet, we're far from extravagant. We budget carefully and prioritize our expenses, but in the eyes of my family, we might as well be millionaires. Poverty, after all, shapes perception, and for my family, anyone who isn't struggling is perceived as wealthy beyond measure. This stark disparity in perception has created tension, especially between my mother and her brother. Their financial struggles have colored their interactions, and my uncle's assumptions about my mother's supposed wealth have only fueled his resentment. He and his wife view my mother's life through a distorted lens, oblivious to the sacrifices she's made and the struggles she's endured. It's as if her role as caregiver, the financial burden she's borne, and the countless ways she's supported our family over the years mean nothing in the face of their misguided envy. This dynamic has only deepened the divide between them, leaving my mother to navigate the complexities of family loyalty, financial necessity, and emotional resilience. Expanding this backdrop offers a glimpse into the intricate web of familial ties, financial burdens, and the weight of responsibility. It sets the stage for the broader narrative, one filled with simmering tensions, unresolved grievances, and the enduring struggle to find balance amidst the chaos of family dynamics. When my grandmother passed, it should have been a time of mourning, a time for the family to come together and honor the life of the woman who held us all together in some way. Instead, It turned into a frenzy of greed and selfishness, led by none other than my uncle and his wife. While we sat at the hospital, holding my grandmother's hand as she took her final breath, my uncle and his wife made a beeline to her home. They knew that once she was gone, the house would be vulnerable, and they wasted no time exploiting that. They cleared out anything that had even a hint of value, both sentimental and monetary. It didn't matter if it was a family heirloom or a keepsake that held memories dear to the rest of us. If they thought it could be sold, hoarded, or claimed as their own, they took it. I remember walking into my grandmother's home after she passed, expecting to find remnants of her life, the little treasures she had accumulated over the years that made her house feel like home. Instead, I was met with emptiness. The walls seemed bare, the shelves were stripped of trinkets, and even the old worn-out furniture that she loved was gone. It was as though her existence had been erased in a matter of hours. My uncle and his wife had taken everything they could carry, leaving behind only what they deemed worthless. The sting of that betrayal still lingers, even decades later. But there was one thing, just one, that we managed to save from their clutches. It wasn't jewelry or fine china or anything that would fetch a high price at a pawn shop. It was a blanket. A simple, heavy, woven blanket that my grandmother used to keep folded at the end of her bed. I remember it vividly. The vibrant colors, the intricate patterns, and the way it felt comforting and warm on chilly nights. My mother had to physically snatch it from my uncle's wife, who had the audacity to try to walk out of the house with it. When I asked for the blanket, hoping to have something to remember my grandmother by, my aunt sneered at me, saying, "You're just a kid. You'll ruin it." I wasn't surprised by her cruelty, but it hurt all the same. My mother wasn't having any of it. She took that blanket right out of my aunt's hands and handed it to me, saying, "This was your grandmother's. It belongs to you." I've held on to that blanket ever since. It's been with me through moves, through life changes, and even through raising my own family. 30 years later, it's still in perfect condition, a symbol of resilience and a reminder of the love my grandmother had for us, despite the chaos that followed her passing. It's the only thing I have that was hers, the only tangible connection to the woman who played such a significant role in my early years. As time went on, I often wondered what happened to all the other items my grandmother cherished. There were family heirlooms, things that held stories and memories, but they vanished without a trace. No one knew where they went, and no one dared ask my uncle. We all knew he would deny taking them, even if we found them sitting in his living room. It was easier to let it go than to stir up more family drama. But the loss of those items wasn't about their monetary value, it was about the memories they carried. Memories that were now lost, thanks to greed. Years passed, and life moved on. My mother continued to struggle financially, while my uncle and his wife continued to live as though they were entitled to more than their fair share. It was during one of my late-night internet searches that I stumbled upon something unexpected. I discovered that you could search for unclaimed property and missing funds online. It became a sort of hobby for me, searching for forgotten checks, insurance policies, and other loose ends that people often overlook. I started with my own family, curious to see if there were any hidden treasures waiting to be claimed. I found a few small amounts here and there. My husband had an old job check for about $300 that he had never picked up. My brother had a couple of minor claims, nothing significant. But then, I found something that made my heart skip a beat: a $500 burial policy in my grandmother's name. It hadn't been claimed. The policy had been sitting there for years, waiting for someone to file the necessary paperwork to collect it. I immediately told my mother about it, knowing that she would appreciate the small windfall. We both knew from previous inheritance dealings that the company handling the policy would require a death certificate to release the funds. It was a simple matter of providing the right documents and collecting what was rightfully hers. Or so we thought. When my mother called the company to inquire about the policy, the representative on the other end of the line hesitated. There was an awkward pause before they explained that someone had already tried to file a claim. My mother was confused. No one in our immediate family had mentioned the policy before I found it, so who could have tried to claim it? The answer became painfully clear when the representative continued. They told my mother that the claim had been denied because the person attempting to collect the funds was unable to provide all the required letters from the surviving children. Specifically, they couldn't provide proof of my mother's death. My mother's death? The realization hit us like a freight train. Someone had told the company that my mother was deceased in an attempt to bypass her and claim the entire policy for themselves. There was no doubt in our minds who was behind it. My greedy uncle, the same man who had cleared out my grandmother's home while we sat by her deathbed, the same man who had always resented my mother for reasons we could never fully understand, had lied about her death to collect an extra $250. $250. That was the price he put on his sister's life. When he was asked to provide a death certificate to support his claim, he couldn't. Of course, he couldn't. My mother was very much alive, and his life fell apart under scrutiny. The company refused to release the funds without the proper documentation, and the policy remained unclaimed. My mother was furious, but she refused to take any further action. She wouldn't pursue her half of the money, even though it was rightfully hers. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the betrayal, the audacity, and the sheer pettiness of her own brother lying about her death for a few $100s. Out of spite, or perhaps out of a desire to avoid further conflict, she let it go. She didn't want to deal with the hassle, the paperwork, or the emotional toll it would take to fight for what was hers. She washed her hands of the situation, leaving the policy unclaimed and the wound left by her brother's betrayal to fester. To me, it was infuriating. How could someone stoop so low? How could anyone lie about their sibling's death just to pocket a little extra cash? It was a question that gnawed at me, a question that had no satisfying answer. If you've made it this far, you've probably figured out that my family history is a twisted mess of greed, betrayal, and entitlement. Honestly, it's exhausting to think about sometimes. But we're not done yet. Here's where things take another turn, because, of course, my uncle never seems to quit when it comes to finding new ways to mooch off the people around him. My uncle has 4 kids. 4 grown adults who are more than capable of taking care of their own affairs. But somehow, that responsibility always seems to land on someone else's shoulders, usually my mother's. For context, my good uncle, the one who passed away and left his share of the royalties to his kids, had planned ahead. He made sure his children wouldn't have to go through the headache of probate court or jump through endless legal hoops. All they had to do was file a document with the company managing the royalties, and they were set. No drama, no hassle, just a smooth transition of assets from parent to child. That's how things should be, in my opinion. Straightforward, respectful, and drama-free. Well, my greedy uncle caught wind of this process and immediately decided he wanted the same arrangement for his own kids. Fair enough, right? It makes sense to want to ensure that your children don't have to deal with unnecessary legal complications after you pass. But here's where things go off the rails because, of course, this is my uncle we're talking about. He called my mom to ask for details about how to set up this arrangement. Now, keep in mind, my mom has bent over backward for this man throughout her entire life. She's taken care of their dying relatives, handled financial messes that weren't hers to clean up, and has consistently been the one to step in when things got difficult. And yet, he still has the audacity to treat her like she owes him something. My mom, being the helpful person she is, gave him all the information he needed. She told him about the attorney I used to handle the paperwork for my own mother's share of the royalties. She even told him the cost $600. When my good uncle had his paperwork done years ago, it was only $100. But times have changed, and prices have gone up. That's just how it is. My mom advised him to get it done sooner rather than later, to avoid any further increases in cost. And then came the kicker. My uncle, in his usual entitled fashion, told my mom that he wanted her to handle the process for him and that she should pay for it. Let that sink in for a moment. This man, who once tried to claim my mother was dead to pocket a $500 burial policy, now expected her to shell out $600 of her own money to make things easier for him and his kids. The sheer audacity of it was mind-blowing. Here's the thing, my mom doesn't have that kind of money lying around. Even if she wanted to help him out, it simply wasn't possible. But that didn't stop him from pushing further. When my mom told him she couldn't afford it, he had the nerve to suggest that my husband should pay for it instead. According to him, my husband makes plenty of money, so why not cover the cost? When my mom told me this, I couldn't help but laugh. The audacity? The absolute nerve. There was no way I was going to pay a single cent toward helping my uncle sort out his affairs. Not after everything he had done. Not after he tried to erase my mother from existence for the sake of a few extra dollars. I told my mom, flat out, that I wasn't interested in entertaining the idea. I was willing to help in other ways, of course. I told her I'd be happy to send my cousin, the eldest of my uncle's kids, all the information they'd need to get started. I'd even scan and send the documents I had from my own experience to save them time and effort. But under no circumstances was I going to reach into my own pocket to make their lives easier. If they wanted it done, they could figure out how to pay for it themselves. Frankly, it wasn't that hard to come up with the money. My uncle receives a monthly stipend of $150 from the royalties. He could easily save that money for a few months and pay for the paperwork on his own. It wasn't like I was asking him to move mountains or take out a loan. He just needed to manage his finances like an adult. But, as usual, my mom wasn't thrilled with my stance. She's always been the peacekeeper in the family, the one who tries to smooth things over and avoid conflict. She told me I was holding a grudge and that I needed to learn to let things go. According to her, it wasn't healthy to dwell on past grievances. I understand where she's coming from, to a point. But this wasn't about holding a grudge. This was about setting boundaries. It was about refusing to be taken advantage of by someone who had shown, time and time again, that they couldn't be trusted. If the roles were reversed, I highly doubt my uncle would lift a finger to help us. He wouldn't even hand over paperwork to save us time, let alone cover any costs. The thing is, I'm not a spiteful person. If it had been my good uncle's kids asking for help, I wouldn't have hesitated. I would have done whatever I could to make things easier for them, because they've always been kind and respectful. But my greedy uncle? Absolutely not. He's burned too many bridges, and I'm not about to let him walk all over me or my family again. My mom, of course, gave me the standard guilt trip that all moms seem to have perfected. She didn't outright ask me to pay for the paperwork or demand that I change my mind. But she made it clear that she wasn't happy with my reasoning. She didn't like that my refusal to help was rooted in my uncle's past behavior. She wanted me to be the bigger person, to rise above the pettiness and negativity. But here's the thing, it's not petty to protect yourself from being exploited. It's not negative to recognize when someone is toxic and set boundaries accordingly. I've learned that people like my uncle will always take more than they give. They'll push and push until you draw a line in the sand, and even then, they'll try to cross it. They'll play the victim, guilt trip you, and make you feel like you are the one in the wrong. But I refuse to fall for it. I refuse to let my uncle or anyone else take advantage of me or my family. If he wants that paperwork done, he can figure it out. He can save his stipend, ask his kids to chip in, or find some other way to cover the cost. It's not my responsibility, and it never will be. My priority is protecting my family, the family that has always been there for me, the family that has never tried to screw me over for a quick buck. My mom may think I'm holding a grudge, but I see it differently. I'm setting boundaries. I'm standing up for what's right. And, honestly, it feels pretty damn good. I've been turning this whole situation over in my head, trying to figure out if I'm being unreasonable. It's easy to get caught up in the guilt my mom lays on me, even when I know deep down that my decision is justified. She's not wrong to say that holding on to negativity can weigh you down, but this isn't about stewing in anger or dwelling on past slights. It's about drawing a line and refusing to let someone who has proven their greed take advantage of me again. My mom doesn't seem to see it that way. In her mind, family is family, no matter how selfish or toxic they may be. She believes in keeping the peace, even if it means letting people walk all over you. She would never ask me outright to pay for my uncle's paperwork, but her disapproval hangs in the air every time we talk about it. It's not about the money for her, it's about my attitude, my refusal to let bygones be bygones. She thinks I'm punishing my cousins for their father's sins, but that's not it at all. If my good uncle's kids needed help, I wouldn't hesitate to step up. The difference is that they've never tried to take more than their fair share. They've never lied, cheated, or stolen from family to get ahead. My decision isn't about holding a grudge. It's about setting boundaries with people who have shown they'll exploit any opportunity they're given. The irony in all of this is that my uncle's health is failing. He's not going to be around much longer. He's in the end stages of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a slow, suffocating decline that leaves you gasping for every breath. I don't wish him harm, but I can't help feeling that life has a way of balancing the scales. For years, he's been taking from others, grabbing at anything he could get his hands on. Now, he's running out of time, and he's scrambling to set things up so his kids can continue to benefit from what little our family has left. His legacy, if you can call it that, is one of selfishness and entitlement. And he expects us to pay to secure it for him. His children aren't helpless, either. My cousins are all in their early 30s and older, more than capable of managing their own affairs. One of them is a nurse, doing well enough now that she's finally out of the projects. She's worked hard to get to where she is, and I respect that. If she sat down, made a plan, and saved diligently, she could manage the $600 it would cost to handle the paperwork. It's not an impossible sum. It's not a life-changing amount of money. But the way they've approached this situation makes it clear that they'd rather someone else foot the bill. It's the same pattern I've seen time and time again with my uncle and his family. They want the benefits without the burden. They want to reap the rewards of our grandmother's legacy without putting any effort to make it happen. And, of course, they expect us, my mom, me, and even my husband, to pick up the tab. I've done the mental gymnastics to try and justify why I should help them. I've thought about the fact that my cousins didn't directly do anything to me. But at the end of the day, they've benefited from their father's greed. They've stood by and watched him take and take without ever stepping in to say, "That's enough." And now, they're carrying on his legacy by asking for more. Maybe I am holding a grudge, but I don't think that's a bad thing in this case. There's a difference between holding on to petty grievances and recognizing when someone has crossed a line. My uncle crossed that line long ago, and I'm done pretending like it didn't happen. It's not about the money. It's about self-respect. It's about valuing my time, my energy, and my hard-earned resources enough to say, no. It's about refusing to let history repeat itself. And it's about teaching my own kids that it's okay to set boundaries, even with family. My mom may never fully understand my perspective. To her, family ties are sacred, unbreakable, and worth more than any amount of money. She grew up in a world where loyalty to family was everything, even when that loyalty wasn't reciprocated. But I refuse to pass that mindset down to my children. I refuse to teach them that it's okay to let people take advantage of you just because you share DNA. There's a part of me that feels sorry for my uncle. His greed has isolated him. His refusal to share, to give without expecting something in return, has left him with a fractured family. His own children are more focused on what they can get out of the situation than on spending what little time they have left with their father. They see the royalty checks as a lifeline, a way to stay afloat financially, rather than as a legacy to be cherished. They're already thinking about the paperwork, the inheritance, and the money that will come when he's gone. And that's the saddest part of all. The very thing my uncle has spent his life chasing wealth has left him with nothing but a strained relationship with his family. His final days are overshadowed by legal documents and financial concerns, instead of love and connection. And yet, he doesn't seem to see the irony in any of it. He's still asking for more, still expecting others to clean up his messes, even as his health declines. So, am I the asshole for refusing to pay $600 to make things easier for my cousins? I don't think so. I think I'm standing up for myself, for my mother, and for what's right. I'm setting a boundary that should have been set long ago. And while my mom may never fully agree with my decision, I know it's the right one for me. I've come to terms with the fact that family isn't always what you want it to be. Sometimes, the people you're supposed to trust the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. But you don't have to carry that hurt with you forever. You can learn from it, set boundaries, and move forward. My uncle's story is nearing its end, but mine isn't. I'm choosing to write my own ending, one that doesn't involve being taken advantage of by people who've already shown me who they really are. If that makes me the asshole, so be it. I'd rather be an asshole with self-respect than a doormat for someone else's greed. And in the end, that's what this story is really about. It's about respect for myself, for my mom, and for the family legacy that my grandmother left behind. A legacy that's worth more than any royalty check or burial policy. It's a legacy of love, resilience, and knowing when to say, enough is enough.